So this is just me talking through the page in the booklet about the passive, where we look at prescriptivism and descriptivism. And on the left-hand side, we're going to see a prescriptivist approach. And then on the right-hand side, we're going to see a descriptivist approach to the topic. So we're going to start off by looking at what is the passive. So the passive is a way of shifting focus from the subject of an action to its object. So a sentence moves from one type of sentence to another. We call this the passive or the active voice. Here's an example of the active. I made mistakes. I is the subject, the person or thing doing the object. The verb is the action, and mistakes is the object. Okay? So most English sentences are structured so that they go subject, verb, object. But we do have other options. So we can switch the order of the subject and the object, and we can push the mistakes to the start of the sentence, and we could begin the sentence, mistakes were made by me. So what happens here is the by me bit, who does the mistake or who was responsible for the action, the subject, has moved to the end, and I put it in brackets on the sheet because it actually becomes optional at this point. So it's a way that people have often pointed this out, that politicians can avoid taking responsibility for the actions that they've carried out. So active is when you go subject, verb, object. Passive is when usually you begin with the object, then the verb, and then the subject can sometimes become optional and can drop out. So David Crystal gives an example of a boy who smashes a greenhouse window and says, instead of I broke the window, goes in and reports it to his parents, thinking he can evade blame by saying, the window was broken. He doesn't add by me. Okay? So because of this slippery nature of it, that you can evade responsibility, there are lots of writers that don't like it. And one of them is, I'm afraid to say, one of my favourite writers, George Orwell, who wrote a long essay called Politics and the English Language in 1946. I'll tell you a bit about him. So George Orwell is a British novelist and journalist. You'll probably know 1984 or Animal Farm if you don't know anything else by him. And alongside writing novels, he also wrote lots of essays, including this very famous one about the English language, in which he got a lot of his bugbears off his chest. Okay, a lot of his kind of concerns about English. So he wrote in his essay, one of his many points about the way that politics and language go together for him is that the use of the passive voice creates this slippery feeling where it's weak and ineffective in his eyes. And he says in the essay, never use the passive when you can use the active. So that is about as definitive as a point of view can be. So he looks at these examples we've just shown you, right, and says, whenever possible, use the active. That sounds like quite a reasonable thing to say, doesn't it? Because I made mistakes, it seems honest and clear. But there's something really interesting about the passive voice, and that is that we need the passive voice. So we can see examples of the passive voice everywhere all the time, and they're not always trying to evade responsibility. Sometimes they get around rather difficult and tedious ways of saying things. For example, you might say taxes were raised. It doesn't necessarily need you to say who raised the taxes in the government. So sometimes the subject of the sentence is not necessarily important. Anyway, it is actually a little bit irrational to insist on one thing being better than the other, because when it comes down to it, the emphasis is different. But aren't you saying the same thing with I made mistakes and mistakes were made by me? But you know what? This is a really interesting thing about prescriptivists. They do often have things that bother them that are not necessarily rational, sensible, or things that other people all agree with them on. Even other descriptivists might not agree with them that the passive is a bad thing. let's have a look at what a descriptivist makes of it. So if I look over to the right hand side, I can see Jeff Pullum, who is probably the world's greatest living working linguist. And okay, I hope David Crystal never ever finds out that I said that, but David Crystal is absolutely fantastic as a popularizer of linguistics. But Jeff Pullum is, to me, one of the real legends of linguistics in his ability to, he's always there commenting on cultural uses of language through this website called Language Log that he's got. He also wrote this the Cambridge Encyclopedia of Linguistics, which basically is the real rule book of linguistics at the moment, if there is such a thing. Okay, so Pullum studied writers who were critical of the passive voice, not just Orwell, but there are other writers who write style guides who criticize the use of the passive voice. So there's a famous style guide by two writers called Strunk and White, who wrote about the passive voice and really sort of dunked on it as well. He studied them, and here is a very interesting finding, and I love the way that sometimes quantifying and analyzing things can bring stuff like this out. Here's a quote from him. Writers who criticize the passive are often more likely to use it. He found that 20% of the constructions in Orwell's Politics in the English Language were actually passives. So even in the actual essay which Orwell was writing, in which he criticized the passive, he was using the passive more than most ordinary people do. That is so fascinating, isn't it? That prescriptivists are so often guilty of the very thing they're criticizing people of. His comment here is quite funny. Clearly, he found the construction useful. So this is a really interesting case where you can see my bias coming through, can't you? That as a linguist, we should be really wary of making judgments about things. So this is why we talk about the passive. When you get a question in standard English that asks you about how do writers and speakers judge different forms, whether they're spoken or written, well, this is a classic example of a written form that some writers are very critical of. I'm going to name some other writers who also criticize this. So we've mentioned some style guides. There's also Stephen King. Stephen King, one of my favorite writers, in his book on writing, has a section where he criticizes, he gives you examples of the passive and says how the active is so much better. He may well understand the passive, but I don't think he's necessarily right about it. He might be right about a very specific kind of using the passive, like when you're trying to evade responsibility, which I would agree can be really slippery. But in itself, there's nothing wrong with using the passive. Okay, so I hope that's been a bit helpful. This is just me exploding a particularly tricky bit of the standard English booklet for you. I hope that's been helpful. Okay, now turn over the sheet and have a go at doing some of the questions on the other side. Thanks very much for listening. Bye.